This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, where I'm very pleased to have made the acquaintance of Jerry from Scotland, who's done a lot of research on the structure of the Twin Towers, which is an enormously important subject when it comes to sorting out exactly how they were taken down or blown apart. Frankly, it's important to understand from the beginning that this was not a collapse of any kind. In fact, it was actually physically impossible for the Twin Towers to collapse. And what we're going to find here through this discussion with Jerry are some of the details of the structure, the engineering, the design of the building that made it so robust. It's been described in some contexts as a tube within a tube, as Jerry's going to explain. Actually, it's a triangle within a square, but where the triangle and the square represent the more massive steel structures that support the building in its entirety. Jerry, I'm so pleased to have made your acquaintance.
And yes, likewise, Jim. I've listened to your program and stuff over the years. It's good to catch up with you.
Please do begin with the square and the triangle.
The rectangle in the center. Yes, we have a square building, and I'm going to try and keep this less technical in terms of numbers and stuff. I mean, I'm not one of these guys that can rattle off the coefficient of thermal expansion of steel and stuff. So I'm going to try and keep it fairly basic. What we have here is we have this square building, square perimeter, and inside that square perimeter we have a rectangular core column structure, and this results in having a short span side and a long span side because of the rectangle in a square. And recently, having studied Building 7 with a research group, that moved on through getting access to the structural drawings, being able to ascertain what NIST had done in terms of what they'd left out, what they'd kept in. So I recently obtained the structural drawing books for the Twin Towers, somewhat to my surprise. NIST were quite forthcoming with them. So it certainly has informed the debate, if you like. And it's certainly got to a point now where the information is such that it really requires the attention of people with that very specific knowledge. You know, you don't just get one kind of engineer to build these kind of towers. You're not going to get one engineer just to look at these drawings and to know what happened. Very basically, this is an outline of the tower. This is a tower under construction.
This is a sensational photograph, Jerry. I can't tell you how important it is. You see here the South Tower going up, and to the right you can see what's known colloquially as the bathtub, the foundation where the North Tower would go, where it's built. Both towers were built within a dike that was intended to keep Hudson River water out. Indeed, I am convinced, Jerry, that the reason they had to devise an ingenious mode of demolition was to ensure that no substantial part of these massive 500,000-ton buildings came down into the bathtub, because had they crushed or severely damaged the bathtub, then Hudson River water would have flowed beneath Lower Manhattan, the most valuable real estate in the world. So they were eager to avoid that outcome and spent a great deal of time in devising a very clever plan to avoid that outcome.
Yes, it would have flooded. Really, I know that the name's a bathtub. It's kind of a reverse bathtub, because it's there to keep the water out rather than to keep the water in, as a bathtub does. And there was huge concern after these buildings came down as to the state that these walls were in. They used a slurry trench method around the site there. As they were excavating, what they would do is they would get a clamshell type digger to go down and make a hole. They would put some rebar in, then they would pour I can't remember. I can't remember. It was a heavy substance they would pour in. It would sink to the bottom. The water would come out. They would be left with a wall, and in that way, they managed to secure the perimeter of the site. I believe they actually made Battery Park, that area, from the overburden that they took out to make this foundation. That they actually created quite a large part of real estate in New York by doing that, which is.
I got to tell you, Jerry, this is the single most interesting photograph I've ever seen of the Twin Towers. It's absolutely fascinating.
Yes, I mean, I've looked at hours and hours of pictures there. There's actually a brilliant collection if anybody's inspired to go and look at Skyscraper City. There's a huge collection of these towers under construction. And if I can quickly move on to another.
Sure. And we can come back and forth. Go.
Yeah, here's a picture of a typical floor in the tower, for example. This is an example of some of the photographs that are available.
Just for the general information of the audience, within that rectangle were 47 massive core columns that were 6 inches thick in the sub-basement, working up to about a 1/4 inch thick at the top, which provided the primary form of support for the buildings, but surrounded by 240 external steel support columns, which were formidable in and of themselves, which were connected by steel trusses, connected at one end then to the core columns, at the other to the external steel support columns, and filled with 4 to 8 inches of concrete, the variance being because the trusses had 4-foot deep V-shaped grooves. So in some areas you'd have a depth of 8, in others 4, which meant, since the buildings were 208 feet on a side, that each floor represented an acre of concrete on a steel truss.
Yes, these things were massive in every sense of the word. You were mentioning the core columns, the dimension of some of the core columns, and that goes quite well into, for example, here's column 508A, and just for orientation, I can show you on a diagram. If this was the north face of the building here, column 508 would be at this corner. That would be that corner column. So the kind of detail that's come out in these drawings is that if we wanted to know what that core column was at the very bottom, we can go in and we can actually see the dimensions of it, and more applicable to the NIST analysis, if we wanted to go in and see what column 508 was at floor 96, we know that it's a column type 112. It's a 14WF426. And it has a connection type 101D at the bottom flange. So we now have access to this kind of detail. These numbers matter in terms of being able to know how good a job NIST did in replicating the building, but also they matter in terms of the ability that people have to go away and say, well, let's analyze this, and that's something that's interesting me a great deal. The core column, just to quickly go through this picture, we have the square perimeter, we have a rectangle, which in which the 47 core columns would be housed, and on these long faces here, we have long span trusses spanning from the perimeter into the core, and we have short span ones along the other side of that rectangle. So that very basically, there comes an area outside of the core where these long span trusses obviously cannot sit on the core. They have to sit on a transfer truss. So that's there in blue, and this is the kind of area of the building that I'm looking at. And just to give us some orientation around the building. If we were standing up at the, what would be the northwest corner, sorry, of the building, up where my mouse is there, and we were looking south towards this end, here's a picture of what we would see. And you can see that that's color coded there to show these long spans, and they would feed into the blue transfer truss. Then we would have short span ones running in the opposite direction, and then long spans here. So the building isn't the same floor to floor, but it has similarities, but it's not identical at floor to floor. NIST made a few very questionable compromises in their analysis.
Were these trusses actually painted red and yellow as shown here, or was that added to highlight?
I added that so that this,
very good, yeah,
this animation here basically lines up.
And you're saying they took some shortcuts in the construction of the building?
They certainly did. Yeah, well, NIST took some shortcuts in their analysis of the building.
In other words, the way NIST modeled the building was not comparable to the reality of the building, with a more complex and no doubt more robust structure.
Yes, so some of the compromises that they made, for example, were to say that all of these columns in the core there connected in the same way, and all of these ones connected in the same way, when they didn't. They made some more serious, in my opinion, more serious compromises, I think is a polite word for it.
Yeah, Jerry, I mean, they were cheating. There's no doubt about it, because they couldn't demonstrate the collapse of a 100-story building when it was designed in such a way that it could not physically collapse. So obviously they had to shortchange features of the building to make it appear, because anyone with a serious understanding of the building would realize it was a falsification to have been capable of undergoing a collapse, which in fact did not occur.
Well, one of the, in my mind, the most serious aspect of the, and I'll call them compromises. It's a very polite word. Let's say the omissions that were made. If we have a look at these yellow trusses here, which represent double trusses going down, if you look, running at 90 degrees to them, we have these in white. We have these trusses here that are running at 90 degrees, and they would be called bridging trusses by NIST. You can see them here in grey on that side, and you can see two of them here in red. Now, one of the things that, and the most serious thing that I believe NIST have done in their analysis is to remove these. These were anywhere where they would be opposite a core. So between these two blue lines, for example, these two red trusses that are running in this direction were removed. They were just left out of the analysis. They done two ANSYS models. ANSYS is an analysis program that you can put a model of a building in and then subject that building to a series of forces in terms of temperature and lateral force and all kinds of you can do all manner of things to a model.
You're already exposing why they wouldn't release the data they had used for their simulation of how it had happened, which of course only went to the point of collapse initiation. They never released any report about the actual sequence of the alleged collapse. They simply asserted it had taken place without illustrating or demonstrating how it was even possible.
Yeah, global collapse ensued, I think, is the phrase that they used. And what I didn't realize is at the time of the NIST report coming out was that NIST had actually got a third-party company to do the modelling for them. Maybe not the input, but the model was produced by a company, Simpson, Gumpertz and Hagel, I believe. SGH were the company who did the modelling for ANSYS.
I'm going to make a wild conjecture, Jerry, that SPH actually works for CIA.
That could well be the case. I couldn't possibly say, but certainly the model that they produced in some terms was accurate, because NIST released an ANSYS model which was only a few stories of the building, and it contained these bridging trusses in the one-way zones. The one-way zones would be anywhere that has got a opposite the core column structure. So not the corners. The corners would be two-way zones. And the other bit, like where these between these blue lines, for example, would be a one-way zone. So if you look at their model, they include things like if we go back to this, you can see they removed deck support angles, which were 3-inch by 2-inch, quarter-inch steel plates that helped support the deck. The spandrel studs, which would be horizontal shear studs on the outside, on the perimeter, around the perimeter. So they were removed. The bridging trusses outside of the two-way zones were removed, and the strap anchors were removed. I've got a picture of a strap anchor. That's not one. Somewhere. I can't seem to find that. But basically, if you look at down here, you'll see a little triangle there. And these are strap anchors. And what they do is they stiffen the whole floor system on the outside. So these were removed in the model as well. And what they did was they ran a simulation with all of these things included: bridging trusses, strap anchors, shear studs, all of those included. They ran a small scale model, and what they said was that these elements of the building failed early. Therefore, we will remove those from our full model. Now, on the face of it, that may sound reasonable, but the whole building wasn't subjected to the conditions that they subjected their small-scale model from. For example, at floor 32, why would you remove the strap anchors? Because they failed in an analysis away up at floor 96 that you subjected to a whole lot of heat. How can that be justifiable? And they kind of hedged their bets by saying, okay, we need to increase computational efficiency here. In other words, it would take them 8 weeks to do a simulation instead of 8 months. And I think that's a cop-out. I really do.
Well, sure, it's an excuse for simplifying the design, making it far more flimsy and amenable to the theory predetermined that they have to demonstrate a collapse when the collapse couldn't possibly have taken place.
Yes, it's when you look at for example, this is part of of an illustration. This is what we were told happened. That this is the outside of the building here, and these are floor trusses that are failing. Now that's a very, very even in construction, the building never looked like this, ever. There would be bridging trusses going along here. There would be strap anchors there. There would be four or so inches of concrete with shear studs above it. You can hear the Les Robertson, for example, in April 2002, before it was clear what direction NIST were going to go in, what they were going to blame for this. You can hear him espousing just how much of a grid of steel these floor trusses actually represented. He actually states in, I can't remember what university that he was talking in, but he actually states, he says you can remove 6, 7 or 8 of these trusses in any one place, depending on where it is, and it will still be fine. I think they were stuck with the truss sagging theory.
Yes.
They were stuck with that because it was observable. You can see the building being pulled in from the outside. So they had to account for that in their explanation, because people, you can look at the videos of this building coming down and you can see that the perimeter columns being pulled in. So they had to justify that somehow. And I would submit that this pulling in of the exterior was achieved by the core column failure. In other words, these core columns are falling and they're pulling on the floor trusses as they're falling, and this is what's pulling the perimeter columns in the way.
My cat has joined us, Jerry.
I hear that. Yes, very well. Welcome to the cat.
Yeah, he's going to get on the air here.
Brilliant. I'm sure he could produce a model of similar accuracy to Nist.
He's about 18 years old. We don't expect to enjoy his company for a great deal longer.
We're lucky to have animals for as long as we do, aren't we?
Indeed.
So, getting back to Nist's model here, when you begin to look, and I'm coming from an area where we looked at Building 7, and we had a look at the drawings, and what David, one of the researchers that we were researching with at the time, he saw these stiffener plates that should have been, which turned out to be quite crucial on a girder, and it's like, well, wait a minute, they've omitted these, they've left them out. There were shear studs on the girder, they've omitted those, they've left them out, and I'm now looking at the towers. I've managed to, and I don't know how, and I don't know why NIST have chosen now to put them out, but I've got these structural drawing books, and I'm looking at it, and I'm seeing exactly the same MO in NIST. They're omitting crucial elements. They're getting very basic stuff wrong. If you can't model this building properly, don't model it. You know, there surely can. If I'm building you a house and I say, okay, there should really be ties between the double skin walls here, so that the wind doesn't take your house and blow it away. But I'm going to leave them out. Then you're not going to be very happy. You're not going to want to stay in that house because it's not safe.
But mind you, Jerry, if you're trying to pull a deception, a deliberate deception, you know you're trying to prove something that if you modeled it accurately would be impossible. You're going to have to take measures to create a simulation that does not correspond to the object being modeled for all the reasons adumbrated above. I mean, they had to fake it. So what you're really getting at is the ways in which they fudge the data from the beginning with regard to the structure of the building.
Yes, I mean, these things are incredibly robust. I would also like to make the point that the concrete with there's a lot of rebar. Rebar is like reinforcement. And for example, this is the floor area.
Right.
Here, the concrete hasn't been poured here.
Right.
You can see the huge amounts of reinforcement that exist.
Right.
In this building. And importantly, if we go back to this, if you look at this, these four corners of the core, if you have a close look there isn't at that height. The higher you go up in these towers, the less elevators there are. You know, it's like there's three sort of sections of the building. So the higher you go up, there's less stairwells and there's less elevators because there's less floors above you to go to.
Yes.
With the result that there's more concrete in the core. So when you look at this whole side here is continuous concrete. There's nothing there to stop that being one whole big composite mass. So if you begin to look at the building, not just as we're presented it from you've got these floor trusses spanning from the core to the perimeter. If you begin to look at us, and we've got this concrete mass here that is going straight from face to face through the core area. What you've got when you look at the impacted building, you know, it's impacted in the north face. When you look at that, the corners are still fine. Well, you know what? Why would the building not be able to redistribute the overstress of that impact? And that's the question that I've been asking myself: is what's going to happen? How is this building going to redistribute itself? And when you examine footage of the impact, the building behaved exactly as it was designed to do. John Skilling was the man who designed these buildings.
Yes.
And he was an absolute genius.
Yes.
When they designed them, they designed them on paper so that, okay, what do we need to do to get this building to stand up? How does it stand up, and what does the wind do to it? And this was the big question, because if you made this building strong enough just to stand up and take the load, nobody would want to be on floor 100 because it would be swinging 7 feet off center. So you have to reinforce it. You have to stiffen the building so that it doesn't overly sway to the point where people will say, I'm not working there, I'm seasick. You know, so they had to really stiffen these buildings up. And the result was a redundancy in the building that is just incredible. I don't think anybody really has seen anything like this, reasonably out with of a very select few people who design and build these kind of structures.
What you're saying is Skilling's ingenious design made the buildings incredibly robust, especially for two of the tallest buildings in the world.
Yes, and especially toward the top of the building, where you would get more sway than you would at the bottom. And this is the enemy of high-rise steel frame buildings, is the amount off center that it's going to sway. For example, if the building went over 2 foot off center in the sway, the elevators would be affected. So the elevators would automatically slow down. They wouldn't move as quickly in the building. There was all kinds of, these guys knew what they were doing. They knew about thermal expansion and stuff, you know, that they knew about what could go wrong. And Skilling stated in the Seattle Times, he was asked what would happen, and I think it was after the 93 attack, what would happen if a plane hit the building? And he'd done an analysis in the 60s, and he was quite blunt in the way that he just said, look, if a plane hits the building, yes, it'll impact it, it'll penetrate the building, there'll be a huge fire, and lots of people will die, particularly above that fire, but the building will stand, the structure will be fine. You can hear that.
Jerry, the very idea the plane would penetrate the building was on the assumption it was hitting vertically between floors. The fact is that Flight 175, for example, was intersecting with 8 different floors, each of which consisted of those acres of concrete on steel trusses. It would have actually crumbled external to the building, not made it inside. And you would have had body, seats, luggage fall to the ground. The engines may have penetrated, but most of the plane not, which is why it would turn out they had to fake it.
Well, it's a difficult area for me, because when I'm listening to Skilling or reading Skilling saying that, I'm ascertaining how strong he's imagining the building to be, rather than an actual impact of a jet. And we may well differ in terms of what we believe in those terms, which is fine. The stage I'm interested in getting to here is to say, well, what did we actually have in terms of the building? What was actually there? Because no matter what you think was the cause of the demise of the building, the reality of the building matters. We need to get some kind of datum point here to be able to say that's what existed, that's what was there. As far as planes hitting it, not hitting it, I would imagine, just off the top of my head, that the plane's hitting a fair bit of glass. You know, it's penetrating.
Well, remember, Jerry, the windows were very narrow because they wanted to make sure that the building didn't heat up to overstrain the air conditioning system. So they actually built the windows very narrow. The vast majority of the surface, the facades of the building, was other than glass. It was steel and concrete.
Yeah, except, I mean, I think they were 3'3" on centre, or somewhere maybe slightly more. On centre, the perimeter columns, and I can accept that there's a bit controversy about what did and didn't happen on the day of 9/11. Looking at it, at the damage that was clearly sustained by the building, and looking at the hole in the building and the alleged damage to the core columns, for example, regardless how that did or didn't happen, there's no way that this building should have fallen. I could see.
Yes, you would surely agree that if real planes had hit the building, there would have been massive collision effects in accordance with Newton's law. Body, seats, luggage, tail, wings would have fallen to the ground, as I was suggesting before, which did not happen. We have photographs of the ground beneath the facades on both buildings, and we do not find airplane debris.
Well, they found a passport, to be fair, allegedly. So
I would say you jest, but they did. They planted a passport. I mean, it's also insulting. Jerry,
incredible. You know, when you see the amount of paper and stuff that is coming down from the building, and all of these documents and stuff that are flying about in the air, that somebody picked up this passport, you know, and said, you know, what's this? I'll take this to my local CIA guy, despite the fact
it was just a local guy, just some random guy who found it. They also planted a fake engine, you know, at Church and Murray that was alleged to have come from Flight 175, but wasn't currently in use by Boeing at the time. So, I mean, we even have a white van where Jack White, who was a legendary student of JFK, who became interested in 9/11, discovered Fox News footage where you see 4 or 5 guys in FBI vests unloading something heavy, making the delivery underneath a steel scaffolding onto the top of a sidewalk, which isn't even damaged, Jerry. And you know that if something that massive had hit at high velocity, it would have done great damage to the sidewalk, but it's just sitting pristinely on top of it.
Yeah, there's some interesting pictures. I don't have them to hand. I don't know if you remember the Lockerbie, similarly controversial event where a Pan Am plane, I can't remember the flight, a Pan Am flight came down in Lockerbie in Scotland, which is quite near our border with England. And this was Almagrahi a case that came down. There's some interesting pictures there.
That appears to have been a CIA effort to implicate Gaddafi in a bombing for which he had no responsibility at all.
Yeah, our government over here released Almagrahi on compassionate grounds, and I think that there was, particularly, I can't remember his name, there's a doctor whose daughter was on that flight from Scotland, and he's the guy who's been standing up ever since and saying we're not being told the truth about what happened. My point is that there's a picture of the engine, one of the engines, and it's impacted the ground in the same way that you're talking. There's huge damage to the road and to the pavement where this engine's impacted it. So
yeah, good. Yeah. Which is a contrast case, because that was a legit crash of an engine, and what we had in New York at Church and Murray was not.
I mean, I don't know if it was Pratt and Whitney or a Rolls Royce engine, but they're comparable. I mean, what we're talking 7 or 8 tons of steel titanium alloy. These things they're not just going to bounce down the street and come to rest without doing some kind of some kind of damage. You talked about some other white vans and stuff.
Oh, yeah. You mean that we're involved in 9/11? Yes.
Yeah,
Israelis who had explosives, they were going to blow up the Lincoln Tunnel, the Holland Tunnel, the Brooklyn Bridge. They were going to isolate Manhattan, Jerry, had it been pulled off as planned.
yeah, urban moving systems, or urban
Right,
removal systems.
right.
You know, into that sort of territory, you can see that there are certainly anomalies around about, and you have to ask yourself, why would your administration not want to look into that? Why would they not want to look into the fact that this company is behaving in a suspicious way, that these people are all going here, there, and everywhere? And when you look at for example, the turn and vector analysis of one of the jets when it comes and impacts the tower, this jet hits exactly the right data. Its rudder's right, its axis is right, everything's right from way over a mile out from the tower to compensate for the wind speed, to compensate for everything, and it hits this tower in it's hitting a pure arc. If it hadn't hit the tower and you continued its trajectory, it would make a perfect circle. That doesn't suggest that if that's a jet, that there's a human being in control of it. I don't know if you've looked at the...
Right. I agree. Yeah. You mean the actual flight trajectory appears to have been an artifact or a construct or artificially controlled or what have you.
Yes, one way or the other, there's something artificial there that isn't
wrong.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at
well, the plane in the videos, Jerry, is actually traveling faster than would be possible for a Boeing 767. Pilots for 9/11 Truth constructed a documentary entitled 9/11 Intercepted, where they explained that plane at that speed, at that altitude, would have physically come apart in the air. It could not have actually hit the tower.
Yeah, they certainly look at... There's an interesting... a thing I looked into. I have some interest in electronics. There's a thing called a QSR-11, which is a triaxial flight control module. Basically, like the bubble that tells you whether you're level or not. It's an electronic version of that. And Boeing were actually fined in the 90s they were fined $16 million or something for being deceptive and adding a QSR-11 into their jets. So if you put this into the wiring harness, then you can begin to remotely control the servo motors, which would control everything in the plane. The rudder, the flaps, the throttle, basically everything to do with this plane. And what Boeing got, and I hope it is Boeing. It was a large. Let's just say it was a large aircraft company that were fined for it. What they were actually fined because this was a technology that they shouldn't have been giving potentially to the enemy. So they were putting these in jets that went to Germany, that went to all over, that they were selling to people. And the QSR-11 triaxial flight control module, you could fit these things in the palm of your hand, and you open the hatch in a Boeing and you plug it in to multi-pin. There it is. So if you look at that kind
easy to hijack a plane.
JPALs, that kind of technology. Boeing, sound like I'm being very anti-Boeing here, and I'm not. Boeing boasted in the early 90s that they couldn't just fly a plane remotely. They could land it, taxi it, put it into the hangar remotely without anybody touching it. This is not a new technology or something.
Right. That's right. It requires sensors, computers, a lot of sophisticated calculations at which computers are extremely good. I agree. I understand. You're 100% on it.
Yeah. So I mean, we have, on one level, we have this huge technological capability. We can fly planes remotely. We can have them doing loop-the-loops if we want to. We can taxi them into hangars, but we don't have, apparently, the technology to accurately model a steel frame building. There's a disconnect here. You know, somewhere where on one hand we can put people on the moon. We can, you know, we can remotely fly a rover on and land it on Mars and have it moving around. But we can't accurately model a couple of bits of steel. Okay, that's a huge oversimplification, but we can't accurately model 110 stories of a building.
It's not a question whether we can. The point is they weren't. It was all deliberate and intentional, which of course sheds light on why there were these, in fact, discrepancies. They were by intent, by design, not accidental or incompetence.
Yeah, so it becomes very apparent that there's an unwillingness at some kind of level. There's an unwillingness, in this case, within the US government and administration. There's an unwillingness to have a look at the reality of this building. I mean,
then, Jerry, the fact of the matter is the government was complicit. This was an operation that involved collaboration between the CIA, the neocons in the Department of Defense, and the Mossad. It was a deliberately orchestrated event that was intended to be blamed on Arabs, on Islamic terrorists, to draw the United States into wars in the Middle East, to take out the modern Arab states that served as a counterbalance to Israel's domination of the entire region. In other words, Israel used 9/11 as a recruitment device to draw the United States, its military and its treasury, into endless wars, military ventures to benefit Israel, not the United States, which was very costly. It spent a lot of its treasury and young men and women to benefit Israel. So, you know, the government, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, key players, Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, General Richard Myers, a host of others. It's all a really disgusting story. But the fact is, once you understand the big picture, you realize why NIST somehow provided an inadequate model. That was the whole point, to show something could happen, which had they modeled it accurately, could not have happened.
Yeah, there's a need. There's a need for justification. And when you're looking at a building that's like that, you've got this huge grid of trusses, and then you're looking at something like that, that you have to ask yourself where that comes from. And that unwillingness to look at the reality of the building with NIST in the past has been coupled with an unwillingness to be open with data. In other words, they've said, look, we've got these structural drawing books. We know how these buildings were put together, and you don't. So we know what we're talking about, and you don't, because we've got these. For some reason, and I never did anything too special apart from ask for them. For some reason, they've begun to be open, or more open than they were, about these buildings. And I don't know.
You've had a change of administrations. We're getting further away from 9/11, you know, temporally, historically, politically, and there's a less sense of allegiance and loyalty and less of an enforcement mechanism. People were taken out, Jerry, for wanting to tell the truth about 9/11. I mean, you know, there was a real atmosphere of fear within the administration that you better not talk or you might have a tremendously abbreviated lifespan.
Or yeah, you might get some anthrax in the post or something.
For example.
On there. I mean, I don't know if you remember the anthrax.
Sure.
You know, that was certainly, when you look at the people who were targeted by the anthrax, it's also interesting to look at who had access to the antidote.
Tom Daschle and who is a majority leader and the head of the Senate Judiciary, Patrick Leahy, were targets of anthrax when they wanted to hold hearings in relation to the Patriot Act, which was being rushed through Congress without anyone having actually even read it.
Yes, I mean, these were surely the darkest of times for America. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to sound un-American because I'm certainly not. But I think that
Jerry, truth is not un-American. I endorse the truth, and much of it, unfortunately, reflects very badly on past administrations of the United States.
yeah, I mean, for example, over here in Great Britain, I think we probably invented most types of corruption politically, you know, and false flags and
We've
stuff,
had
you
a
know.
few more
Yeah,
years under your belt to do it. I mean, look, there's an attack in the United States on conspiracy theories, which are supposed to be forbidden. But what would Shakespeare have had to write about but for plots against the kings and queens of England? I mean, for crying out loud, if you don't understand conspiracies, you don't understand most of political life.
yeah, but there, I think it's we've moved to a point now from the outside looking into America. We've certainly moved to a point where it has become the most unpatriotic of acts to question your government. This is what you're told. You know that this
Well,
juxtaposition.
actually, Jerry, I'll tell you, there's a mass media crackdown because too many are questioning the government. The development of the alternative media through the internet has made such a difference. They're now trying to stifle it, and they're taking all kinds of measures that are going to eventually be reined in. It's fascinating. They had a tremendous backfire here when Google and YouTube and Facebook and Twitter all crashed Alex Jones. They were taking him out pretty much altogether. But he had a new newsletter with an InfoWars app, which has taken control of the country. He got 6 million subscribers in 48 hours, Jerry. This has just happened this week.
Yes, I mean, I've actually I met Alex Jones in Watford in London, and we were at the Bilderberg. I think it was 2014.
Yeah.
The Bilderberg were meeting there. We were down there, and we had the pleasure of Alex Jones' company for a
Well,
while.
Jerry, it's backfired. Their effort to suppress Alex Jones has turned him into what one expert commentator for the New York Times said. He's gone from a niche operation to mainstream.
Yes, and they've shot themselves in the foot because nobody in the mainstream reasonably, what their way of dealing with these things is to say, la, 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 that's not happening and I'm not listening. And he never reaches the mainstream. All of a sudden, the top thing that's trending on Twitter worldwide is Alex Jones. The person on CNN is Alex Jones.
Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? I love it. I love it. Jerry, this has been completely brilliant. Is there anything you'd like to add at this point?
I would just like to add that in the past, I've been involved in research where people have become party to information which has been sought after. For example, structural drawings of buildings. I'm going to do everything within my power to make sure that this release of these drawings is available to anybody who wants to go and look at it. There's a few organisations certainly that are going to host them. I've got them on my OneDrive just now, but certainly in the past there has been a tendency even within the research community to say, wait a minute, this is research gold dust, let's keep a hold of that. And I find that abhorrent. And I would implore anybody with the relevant skill set to be able to look at these drawings and to be able to perhaps recreate this building in a model, to seriously consider it. It's
just mentioned, Jerry, before we part, that Robert David Steele, who is not only a former Marine Corps intel officer, but also a former CIA operative who actually himself had conducted some false flag operations, has become a whistleblower and a stand-up guy, and edited a series of studies about 9/11 in memoranda for the President of the United States, with contributions from 27 experts. It's now available on his website. If you go to Robert David Steele Go to the websites within his websites, the Phi Beta Iota, and you can download for yourself his 9/11 POTUS studies. Absolutely stunning stuff. I believe everything you're doing here is highly complementary with his efforts there, Jerry.
Yeah, so I would hope that the analogy that I'll use here is NIST have handed me the ball in giving me these drawing books for some reason, and I'm putting that ball out there because you need a whole variety of skill sets, and you need to have a supercomputer basically to run this analysis.
Yes.
There's the ball. There, it's out there. If somebody wants to do the right thing, the patriotic thing in America, and kick that ball, then they need.
What you're saying is, given the diagrams and so forth that are in your possession, you could actually run a legitimate simulation and discover that, in fact, what NIST told us isn't even physically possible, that the buildings could not have collapsed, and the whole story coming from the government's nothing but an elaborate scam.
Yes, this is the part of the story that you can attack, because you can recreate it, and you can say, here's what you presented, here's what reality is, and here's what would have happened in that analysis had it been done in an honest way. Yes.
Jerry, I think that's absolutely sensational. I can't tell you how glad I am that we have linked up. I'm so pleased you could have the time available to review this today. And I'm just very, very favorably impressed with all of this and what you've been doing, my friend. You are a hero of the 9/11 movement by gaining access to this information, which you are now going to share with the public. Sensational, Jerry, sensational.
Yes, and what I'll do is I'll leave a link with you to the OneDrive files that have these drawings on them. And if you want to pass that on to anybody who wants those.
Excellent, Jerry. Excellent.
Okay.
Well, I can't thank you enough. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my very special guest, Jerry from Scotland, discussing the structure and design of the Twin Towers in New York City, which has been an object of endless fascination and controversy within the 9/11 truth movement. I believe with Jerry's aid, we're making major steps forward in analyzing what happened and disentangling how the government used its own resources, especially the National Institute of Standards and Technology, to deceive and mislead the American people about the events of 9/11. Jim Fetzer thanking my special guest, Jerry, for being here, and all of you for watching.
Thank you.